This is Jay Faerber, and you're watching the TV Writer Podcast.
My name's Gray Jones, and you're watching the TV Writer Podcast, episode 127 for January 11th, 2022. Wow, so exciting to say that. Actually, there will be a bit of this released in 2021, so don't be confused about that date. But I'm here with comic and TV writer Jay Faerber. How you doing, Jay?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to talk to you because you are a genuine longtime writer of comics. You've written some big titles, but then you've also written many television series, and you continue to write for both mediums. And so I think this is going to be a particularly interesting episode.
Awesome.
Now, I should mention that usually this podcast focuses on the TV writer and how they navigate their career, and we will get to that in a bit. But when I called out for questions, I got an unprecedented number. Like, I literally have never had anywhere near that number of people weighing in. And so I didn't think it was fair to those people not to address a few of the things that they were bringing up. And particularly, they were dealing with the finale in the last season of Supergirl. And we generally don't talk plot on this podcast, but we will do this just as an excerpt.
Sure.
I'll put it on YouTube just to address those questions, and then the rest will be our normal format.
Great.
So first of all, the big thing that everybody's talking about is, was there queerbaiting? You hear about this SuperCorp thing. I think definitely, I know from the very beginning of Supergirl that representation was always a big deal on the show, and it's been lauded for that representation. But I think it's a good question to ask, because there is a segment of fans that feel a certain way about how this might happen in the show or that might happen in the show. How much does that get talked about in the writer's room? And what can you tell me about the decision-making process, particularly for these big plot points and big season arcs?
Sure. I mean, it's a complicated subject. Just for one thing, the writer's room is sacred. Sounds like too strong a word, but there has to be trust and a level of comfort in the writer's room for writers to be able to tell stories about themselves, open up emotionally, be vulnerable, to dig deep and find moments from your life that you may want to mine for storytelling. And so I can't really talk in too much detail about decisions and storytelling decisions we made in the writer's room, because I don't want to betray any trust, but also because, like, I'm not the showrunner. I'm a foot soldier on Supergirl. I'm one of many writers, and I don't make the decisions. And on a show like Supergirl, which is based on an IP, an intellectual property, an existing character who's been around for decades, any big storytelling decision in terms of her costume, her love life, her secret identity, her career, all of these things would have to get signed off on. I mean, the showrunner would have to want to do it. DC Comics has to sign off on it. Warner Brothers has to sign off on it. The CW has to sign off on it. So I can't even begin to break down why we chose to tell one story and not another, and whose decision it was. If the showrunners or Warner Brothers wants to peel back the curtain, or pull back the curtain, I guess is the expression, they can, but it's not my place to do that. I will say our writer's room was diverse and inclusive, and we did talk about the romantic pairings of our characters and stuff, but sometimes in storytelling, the story's not always going to go the way that you want it to, or expect it to, or think it should. We just chose to tell the stories that we felt were right for these characters, and that's what ended up on screen.
Yeah, and I think, people have to remember, Melissa Benoist getting a haircut was an issue.
Yeah.
When she went to the bangs, or when she wanted to have pants instead of a skirt.
Right.
These things have to go way up the chain,
Yes.
even for very small decisions like that.
Exactly. So there's a lot of people who have to be on board with any storytelling decision like that. And so I'm just saying, I'm saying that so that it's not all put on the shoulders of the writers. Like, this was our decision to do something or not to do it. Of course, the writers have to be, and the showrunners especially, have to be on board with a story. Like, if they don't want to do it, it's never going to get up to anybody else who has to sign off on it. But the truth is that even the showrunner is considered the boss of the show, and that's true, but only up to a certain extent. There's always somebody they have to answer to, be it the network, the studio, DC Comics, who owns the IP. So it's a lot more complicated, I think, than a lot of people give it credit.
Mm-hmm. And I think perhaps one of the things that might have fed this a little bit is recently Superman's son came out as bisexual in the comics. But even in a case like that, that's a very specific comic.
Right.
It's not necessarily all of the Superman comics, and that's a specific application of that character that won't necessarily translate into Superman and Lois.
Right.
So can you just talk a little bit about DC's involvement in the series?
I mean, yeah, DC would be on notes calls. Like at the beginning of the season, we would normally get like a packet or a binder from DC of potential villains that they were offering up, or supporting characters, or just anybody from their catalog that they thought like, hey, these are available to you if you want, because certain shows get kind of dibs on certain characters, that are part of their their canon. And so sometimes we look at those characters and think, is there anybody we want to use in our season? Or sometimes we'll find a character. We'll be telling a story and think, we should have a villain who could create ice. And then we'll look at the DC Comics characters who can create ice, and we'll find one that we think we can use. And, we'll run that up in DC. We'll either say yes or no. And if they say no, sometimes they'll give us variations on like, you can't use this character, but you can use this one. Alex becoming Sentinel is a good example of that, because we knew we wanted her to have a costumed identity, and but we didn't know what yet exactly. And so I think we talked to DC, and they're like, there's the same Sentinel that we've used in the past for various characters. You can have that if you want. And we thought, that's great. And so we worked that into her story and tied it into John's time on Mars with, why he designated her that name. So DC is involved. They have to approve things, and they're an added benefit. They help us in terms of, like I said, offering up characters that we can use if we want.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember, Supergirl just had its finale. Mm-hmm. The character in the comics is going to live on for a long time. So yes. DC really has a vested interest in the further storytelling of that character.
Totally. And you see, these characters all have different iterations. Like there's going to be a Supergirl in the new Flash movie, apparently, who's not connected to our Supergirl in any way. And the stuff going on in the Supergirl comic right now is not connected to what we've done on the show or what's happening in the Flash movie. So these characters all have different iterations. It'd be kind of funny sometimes in the writer's room. I'd get asked like, well, how is it, what's the canon? How is it in the comics? Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, which comics? Like there's the Peter David run of Supergirl. There's, this run of Supergirl. And there's, she's been changed and rebooted so many times that its canon is kind of a moving target.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I do want to be fair to the fans as well. DC listens.
Yeah.
And if people are vocal, you may just see one of the characters from the Supergirl series end up in the comics, and it's happened before.
Yeah. Dreamer is a good example. Dreamer was originated, our version of Dreamer. She's sort of tied to the Legion, but Nia Nal was created on Supergirl, and now she's appearing in DC Comics. So yeah, these tend to bleed into each other.
Very, very cool. Next question, and there are a couple of questions in this sort of neighborhood, were Jay wrote this episode and this happened. Why does he feel this needs to happen? Mm-hmm. Or something like that. And I think it just betrays sort of perhaps a lack of understanding about the process of how an episode of television is developed.
Yes.
And so why don't you tell me about that, right from the sort of season arcs and how those are decided right on to an episode being written.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I could talk for half an hour about just this part of the process. Yeah. And every writer's room is different. On Supergirl, we would start each season with, we would talk for a couple weeks about that season in particular. What do we want to say? What is the theme of our season? What are we trying to say? And kind of once we settle on that, we'll start talk about more story, like we want to talk about this theme or this subject, but what's the actual story that we're going to tell? And we'll talk for a couple weeks about that, and find the villain that we want to use, as the to help get this story going. And then we'll start breaking down. By that point, we usually know how many episodes we're doing that year. And so we'll put those up on a board of just, if we're doing 20 episodes, we have 20 columns. And we'll just start putting in goalposts or mile markers of, okay, let's say this season's about Supergirl losing her powers. So we think she's going to lose her powers in episode 4. That sounds like a good place. And we'll put down on episode 4. And then in episode 10, a new form of kryptonite arrives on Earth, and it gives her new powers. Okay, so that's episode 10. And then episode 14, we realize these new powers are killing her. That's going to happen around 14. And then in episode 19, they find the cure. And then in episode 20, she can save the day. And so we have our big sort of goalposts, and there's a lot to fill in between there. But that's enough to get us started to breaking individual episodes. And then when we break individual episodes, then we dig into that episode in particular and put that up on a board. And each episode would have a theme. What is the theme of this episode? How do we dramatize that theme? What characters do we have this episode? Because something else people aren't aware of is that not every actor is guaranteed to be in every episode. Even actors whose names appear as series regulars may not be contracted to appear in every single episode. They may be 18 episodes out of 20. And so we have to build in 2 episodes that they don't appear in. Or if we want to use them in all 20, we have to pay them extra for those extra 2 episodes that aren't part of the budget. So those are decisions that have to be made as we break the episodes.
And how many were on the staff in those last couple of seasons?
We had, I believe, 12 writers both seasons that I was on the show. And that includes our 2 showrunners. And so on Supergirl, every episode was co-written. So you'd have at least 2 writers, sometimes 3, sometimes 4 on the episode. And sometimes you would know at the start of the break, when you're talking about that episode, you would know who's going to write it. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you're 3 or 4 days into figuring out what the episode is before it's decided, okay, you 2 are going to write it.
And just so people understand, because I think there'll be a lot of people tuning in who may not know much about television writing. When you say breaking an episode,
yes,
you're going through beat by beat, scene by scene.
Yeah. When I say breaking an episode, that means we're breaking the story. We're figuring out what the story is. We're figuring out the twists and turns, the setups and the payoffs, literally what happens, like you said, in every scene. And we start kind of a bigger picture of what the general shape of the episode is, and you kind of zoom in closer and closer through the process. Like, you'll say, okay, this scene is a fight scene between Supergirl and Lex Luthor. That's enough for now. And then we talk about the next scene and we keep going, and then we'll circle back and get more detail. Okay, we know this is a fight between Supergirl and Lex Luthor, but where's the fight happening? Okay, it's going to be at the waterfront. Okay, well, we'll talk more detail about the fight. What makes this fight different than the other times she's fought Lex? What's he doing? Is it nighttime or daytime? What are the, just what's the choreography? What makes this different? And we'll do that for all the scenes, just getting in more detail. And that's the whole staff. Everybody's in there, the showrunners, all the writers, except for whatever writers might be off writing the previous script. But everybody's collaborating on it. Everybody's pitching ideas, even if it's not their episode. There are plenty of episodes that have moments or like a line of dialogue that I've pitched, but my name isn't on it. And there are plenty of episodes I've written that have these moments that were pitched by other writers, even though their names aren't on it.
And it goes to the outline stage as well, and is that sent to the network?
It goes, yeah. So before we even get to an outline, we first write what's called a story document. Some shows call it a story area, some call it a story arena. And this is anywhere from a page to 4 pages of just sort of a synopsis of what the episode is. Sort of imagine, the back of a Blu-ray or the back of a paperback novel, that sort of summary of the episode. It's kind of like that. Of here's the story we're telling in broad strokes. Here's the emotion. Here are the plot moves. That gets sent to the studio and the network. They chime in with any notes they have, and then it would On some shows, it goes to an outline. By the time I got to Supergirl, we didn't do outlines. Every other show I've been on, you would break down those scenes into an outline of anywhere from 10 to 20 pages, and then that gets sent to the network and the studio. And the outline tells the story scene by scene in kind of an abridged version. Sometimes there's a little bit of sample dialogue. Usually there's not. On Supergirl, I think they started out doing outlines, but I didn't join until season 5, and by that point, I think the studio and the network, everybody trusted that everybody knew what they were doing, and so they didn't need to see an outline at that stage. Sometimes we would run internally just for ourselves to make sure everything kind of felt right. But then we would go off to script, and then the script is divided up. If you have 2 writers, you're each writing half of it. Sometimes you would divide a script up. On Supergirl, we had 6 acts, and divided up by commercial breaks. And so generally, you would each write 3 acts. Sometimes you would divide it up. Okay, you write the first 3, I'm going to write the back 3, and we'll just put it together. Sometimes I'll write acts 1, 3, and 5, and you're going to write 2, 4, and 6, and we put it together. Sometimes it makes more sense to write storylines. Like if Supergirl and Alex are on one storyline and rarely interact with Brainy and Nia and John, who are on a different storyline, sometimes it makes more sense for one writer to write one storyline and the other writer to write another. It makes combining it a little more difficult because then you're literally cutting and pasting every different scene back and forth. But that's another way to write it. And you put them all together into a script. You read it, you give each other notes. Sometimes you'll get notes from other writers, and then it goes to the showrunners for their notes. You'll do a couple rounds of notes with the showrunners. Sometimes the showrunners will take a pass and do a rewrite of their own. Other times they don't, and they'll just give you notes, and you'll do your own rewrite. And once the showrunners are happy with it, then the script goes to the studio, and you get a round of notes from the studio, and then it goes to the network, and you get a round of notes from the network. And then once the network is happy with it, then it goes into production, and you have a production draft, and that's what goes to everybody in Vancouver, and they can start actually working on the episode and building sets and scouting locations and casting guest roles and all that stuff. And then, again, all shows are different. On Supergirl, at least one writer, until COVID hit, would go up to set for that episode. And the next writer would go back into the writer's room and contribute to helping break the next episode. And the writer who's up on set is generally the one who does production rewrites, because this happens all the time. There was an episode I wrote with another writer that was written to have a date between Kara and William, and that date was going to be mini golf. Problem was we were shooting it in Vancouver in January, and there's not going to be mini golf. Nobody's going to play mini golf in January in Vancouver, where it's raining or snowing or just cold and wet. And so we rewrote it to be playing pool at a bar. And so I rewrote it just because of the location. That's something that you rewrite. We're going to shoot it in 2 days, and then the bosses sign off on your rewrite, and it gets woven back into the script. And little things like that will come up on set, little changes you have to make for production, or, hey, this scene is 3 pages and it's great, but our day is really tight, and can you knock off half a page of this scene? And so then you have to go in and rewrite that scene and try to keep all the emotion and all the plot logic and everything, but make it just shorter. Find a way to communicate the same idea, but in less time, to make it more simple to shoot so that we can make our days, which means not going into overtime. So it's a long process, and there's a lot of people involved, and a lot more people than just the 2 or 3 or 4 names that you see on that episode.
Right. And people got to understand, I mean, I've been on the receiving end of notes, and major things can change with every notes pass.
Yeah.
So when the studio showrunner weighs in, when the studio weighs in, when the network weighs in, there can be significant changes, and that continues even into post-production.
Yeah, and there are sometimes things that just get cut for time or get cut for. I've been on episodes, I can't think of any on Supergirl in particular, but where an entire storyline has just been dropped because the episode was too long or it wasn't quite working, and so we'll just drop this, drop this B story, and the episode works without it. And then you have all this stuff that we wrote and shot that actually doesn't make it in the episode.
Wow.
So yeah, a lot of stuff can change. And sometimes it's based on notes because somebody doesn't like what's been written. Other times it's just based on logistics of mini golf sounds great, but we just physically can't make it happen. So what else can we do that captures that same vibe?
Yeah. And you hinted at this a little bit. In a number of other questions, I know have very direct answers, and that's there were some production challenges with COVID and other external forces during the last couple of seasons. Can you talk specifically about those?
Yeah, I mean, I forget the timeline exactly, but I know we knew going into season 6 that Melissa was pregnant and was going to need maternity leaves, and so we had to build that into the story we were telling. So that meant we have to build episodes that don't have a lot of Supergirl in them, and we came up with a plan to send her to the Phantom Zone, and then we block shot some stuff so that we concocted a schedule so that Supergirl could be in every episode, or I think most of them, but we would shoot all of her scenes when she was back from maternity leave, all her scenes in the Phantom Zone. And then we thought, okay, we have a plan. Melissa's maternity leave is going to disrupt things, and we had planned like a mini hiatus for the writers because everything would just shut down for a while, and then COVID happened, and that blew all that up. So then we had to figure out a schedule that would allow us to shoot safely during a pandemic and would also accommodate Melissa's maternity leave. All this was happening at the same time. And so we shut down for a while, and, people who were not me, people higher up on the food chain were the ones who were making these big decisions of, how are we going to do this? It literally changed how many days we would take to shoot an episode because we couldn't move as fast because people had to be masked and there had to be safety protocols and social distancing. And so it made our episodes, we just had to write them differently. The fight scenes couldn't be quite as complicated as they once were. Crowd scenes were harder to do. Intimate scenes between characters who were in a relationship, we had to be careful about that even. I think that there was a scene where Brainy and Nia were going to kiss, but ultimately it turned into either a hug or like a hand on a shoulder, just because the scene didn't need a kiss, and so why risk it? Because this was kind of before vaccine status and all that stuff. So there were a lot of challenges, but our crew and our bosses figured it out, and it was safe. We pulled it off. We did a season of television during a pandemic, but it definitely impacted. It also impacted guest cast, because to fly to Canada, you would have to quarantine for 2 weeks upon arrival before you could even shoot anything. And so if you were casting somebody, you're like, well, can we bring up an actor from Hollywood, or do we need to cast local out of Vancouver? And who can we get, and what makes the most sense? And then, if you're casting an actor who's going to be in 3 episodes in a row, that might make more sense because they can quarantine, be there for 3 whole episodes, and then go home. But if you're having an actor who's going to be in 1 episode and then not one, and then be in the 3rd, like, do they go back and forth and have to quarantine all those times? Or do they just stay in Vancouver the whole time if they're not working? All of these things had to be figured out. It also meant the writers couldn't go to set just because why take that risk? Like, it's very helpful to have them there, but it wasn't absolutely necessary. So instead, the writers would stay here in California and cover set virtually, meaning we would have a live feed on our computer or our iPad of what they were shooting, and we'd be on a constant text or phone call with the director to, like, yeah, that looks good, or, oh, I think maybe we should try it this way, or whatever, if they had questions. But it worked. We made it work. Everybody adapted pretty well. But it definitely had an impact on actors that we could cast and just the kinds of stories and the kind of scenes that we could safely produce.
Wow. Well, I got to say, I have a lot more respect for all of the shows that we're able to release, like Superman and Lois, Supergirl. A number of shows were able to somehow make it through this crazy challenge of the pandemic. And to be fair, I noticed as a viewer a lot of romantic storylines being affected. Like in other shows, it's funny, the kiss happens in a big wide shot instead of in a close shot, so you don't realize they're not actually kissing and things like that. But hey, we got to watch TV through this crazy time.
Exactly. I think it's a testament to how talented these crews are in particular, who pulled off all of this stuff, shooting what I think turned out pretty well in terms of fight scenes and everything that given all the constraints, I'm not saying we should be graded on a curve, but there were a lot of things that happened this season for everyone who was making television.
Very cool. So this is going to end the excerpt, talking specifically about the plot of Supergirl. The rest of the episode will air January 11th, 2022, and I encourage you to check that out. You can find out in a second all the places you can check out the podcast. Please follow me on Twitter for the latest updates. @GrayJones is my handle. Make sure to bookmark tvwriterpodcast.com and scriptmag.com. You can find the video version of this podcast at iTunes, Podbean, and on YouTube. Make sure you do subscribe to all these places. Audio only, you can find us at iTunes, Podbean, Spotify, or Pandora. And on Instagram, you can follow @TVWriterPodcast. AVGearGuide.com uses state-of-the-art technology to bring new life to old films and videos, like the Lost Betty White series Pet Set, which they recently restored for its 50th anniversary. They can apply the same technology to your documentary, film and video archive, and family videos. Visit avgearguide.com for details. DrivingFootage.com provides 360-degree driving plates for film and TV. Over 14,000 clips are available for locations all around Southern California, with more areas coming soon. A fully equipped camera car with height-adjustable rig is available for custom shoots. Visit DrivingFootage.com for details. Full disclosure, I do own both of these companies. By supporting them, you help me bring new in-person video interviews to you. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.